On the 22nd of June 1861, this entire section of London that I'm walking through now, just down from Tower Bridge, I'm walking up to HMS Belfast here, a very well-known and popular area of London, was on fire. Now, of course, it didn't really look like this back then. What is corporate offices and tourist spots and City Hall back then was warehouses. Lots and lots of massive warehouses. And on that hot summer's day in 1861, a fire started here that would burn for 2 whole weeks and would change the way London dealt with fires forever. And we all know London's had a lot of experience dealing with fires now, don't we? This is the Tooley Street fire.
In the mid-19th century, this stretch of the Thames was one of the busiest commercial and storage zones in London. And Tooley Street and its surrounding wharves were packed with huge warehouses stacked with goods from across the empire. And this stretch of London had been used for this kind of industry for a very, very long time. All the way back in 1651, a man named Alexander Hay bought warehouses, a brewhouse and some of the surrounding taverns in the area, which is where Hayes Wharf, now Hayes Galleria, comes from. Now a very popular spot for shopping and dining. Hayes Wharf. Why not enjoy a wonderful alfresco meal here, no longer accompanied by the intense smell of animal fat or whatever had been dumped in the Thames that day. And it was also one of the Hay family, Joseph Hay, who in 1696 formed one of the earliest recorded insurance schemes, the Ye Amicable Contributors. And with that insurance scheme was set up a private contingent of firemen. This will of course have a lot of importance when it comes to the response to this fire.
As always, this is a classic example of how London has shifted from, blue collar to white collar work. Hundreds of years ago, riverside spots like this were places for industry, whereas now they're full of offices. I'll let you be the judge of whether you think that's a positive change or a negative change, but it's fact. Where I'm sitting right now would have been alive with industry, with all kinds of different products being moved and stored here. Unfortunately for this story, a lot of flammable ones.
The Hay family were around here until about 1838 and then sold the business, which is when the enclosed brick dock, which looks a lot more like what we see here today, was built. And in 1857, only 4 years before this fire, Cotton's Wharf was built. Now, of course, the storage of all this important produce for Britain and its empire was incredibly profitable for the guys who were running it. But, as we're about to find out, it was also incredibly dangerous. And it was with good reason that private insurer's fire brigade had been set up.
Now, at the time, this area of London had a bit of a reputation. It became known generally as London's larder. And that's because stored in the warehouses here were 18,000 bales of cotton, thousands of barrels of tallow or animal fat, and on top of that had tons of things like hemp, sugar, juices, all stored here. Lots of flammable food goods. And if you know anything about cotton, you know how flammable that is. And gun cotton is called gun cotton for a reason. I don't think there's any risk of a fire breaking out here today, but it is the warmest day of the year so far, and I can smell something that smells like burnt clutch. So,
it's Saturday, the 22nd of June 1861, the height of summer. And at around 4 p.m, a fire started at Cotton's Wharf. Now, the exact cause was never confirmed. Of course, the amount of forensic investigation we have now to find the cause of a fire wasn't really there in the 19th century. But there were reports suggesting that it could have been spontaneous combustion within some of the stored materials. But it could as easily have been careless handling from workers there. Somebody could have been smoking in and amongst the crates and sacks of produce. Somebody could have been wearing hobnail boots. That was quite commonplace back in the day, and a spark from their boot hitting the ground could have started a fire. It could have been any number of different causes. And in a Victorian warehouse which certainly wasn't following the same fire safety standards that we do now, the safety of the buildings and the workers relied a lot more on people being careful and considerate. And fire wasn't necessarily uncommon in these kinds of places. And this particular fire, at first, seemed reasonably manageable. If the workers or the private firefighters managed to get it under control in time, it shouldn't be much of a problem. But that's not what happened. These warehouses were packed floor to ceiling. These materials that were stacked high in these warehouses didn't just burn normally. They massively intensified the fire, turning it from something that could be manageable to something far more destructive.
And once the fire did start here, it started to feed itself.
Let's just quickly look at what happens when animal fat burns. A 1999 study found that just a small amount of combustible material of tallow, so 1 to 3 grams, if provided with an adequate wick, resulted in only a small fire. In their final larger test, they found that 26 kilograms of animal fat created a much bigger fire that was far more likely to spread and burn other things around it, especially if those things around it were also flammable. So 26 kilograms of animal fat creates a large fire that's very likely to spread. So how much tallow did we have in Cotton's Wharf? Oh yeah, it was about 10,000 barrels. And how much tallow was in roughly one Victorian barrel? Well, that would have been about 300 to 336 pounds. Or, to convert that into metric, roughly 136 to 152 kilograms. And just a quick calculation, just get my calculator out here. That makes for roughly 1.52 million kilograms of animal fat. So, yeah, that's pretty bad.
Now, what happened next is incredibly bad. As the fire spread, it burst barrels of tallow and oils that were kept here. And that then flowed into the Thames. And it being fat and oil, once it hit the water, it didn't just put itself out. What essentially took place was a flaming liquid poured into the Thames and kept burning.
Multiple boats and barges that were floating in the River Thames alongside these warehouses caught fire. This fire that was already spreading across land, jumping from building to building, was no longer contained to just the land. It was now moving, being carried by the actual current of the Thames. Burning oil and tallow poured in cascades from the wharfs and flowed out, blazing on the river. Amongst the boats destroyed were an American steamer, 4 sailing boats, and many, many, many barges.
It must have been absolutely terrifying to see the Thames essentially on fire, as well as backed by these towering, burning warehouses. It must have been an incredible sight to see. Terrible, but incredible. I've seen it described as, the Thames generally being London's lifeline, became a conveyor belt of fire.
Now, to their credit, firefighters did arrive very quickly on the scene. Those private firefighters, or as they were called, the London Fire Engine Establishment, who were being led by Superintendent James Braidwood, mobilised multiple engines on the scene as quickly as they possibly could. But almost immediately, they were completely overwhelmed by the fire. One of the tactics that the firefighters had, especially for locations like this that were right alongside the Thames, was to draw their water from the river itself. But as this late afternoon turned into early evening, the Thames was at low tide, making it incredibly difficult for the firefighters to draw their water from the river. And the land-based water supplies that they could draw upon were very limited and just completely inadequate for the task. Remember, this is a fire that is burning with fuel that's designed to keep fires going. And unfortunately, the water they did have and could spray onto the fire only served to spread it even further. On top of that, talking about those few fire safety options that they had back then, they did have fireproof doors in the warehouses, but they'd all been left open. It's unclear why, but, it was the height of summer, it was probably very warm, maybe they'd been left open to, improve airflow from building to building and maybe relieve the workers in there from some of the smell that you can imagine had built up in the area. But of course, those doors being left open allowed the flames to not only be further fueled by rushing air coming through the buildings, but allowed those flames to spread from building to building even more rapidly. And despite the efforts of those firefighters, the fire quickly grew well beyond their control. Now, given the size that this fire was growing to, you can only imagine that today, a fire of this size would draw upon pretty much all of the firefighting resources that London had available.
By about 6 p.m, there were apparently 14 fire engines here, all tackling this huge blaze. But almost immediately, things started going wrong.
As we've already said, back then, all the firefighting was largely organised through insurance companies, with these smaller private fire brigades who were basically responsible for only a certain company's buildings. And against a fire that was raging now beyond the scope of just one or two warehouses, a small private fire brigade just had no chance at all. And this was something that this fire made very, very apparent, and was ultimately what led to what happened after this fire took place, which we'll come to in a little bit.
I'm currently on Battlebridge Lane. Now, the expanse of this fire was supposed to, at its height, have stretched from a place called St Olave's Church to Battlebridge Stairs. Now, I'm not sure Battlebridge Stairs are still here, at least can't find anything called Battlebridge Stairs. So, the fire stretched from about where I am now to St Olave's Church. So, that is how far this fire spread. Although, this definitely isn't a church anymore.
Now, of course, with a fire of this size, what was at risk was not only property. With something so huge, it was only inevitable that some unfortunate people were going to lose their lives. Superintendent James Braidwood was one of the most experienced firefighters in Britain, let alone in London. And he had spent decades working to improve firefighting techniques. And on this particular day, he found himself leading the response to this disaster. Braidwood had, in his efforts overseeing the response to the fire, noticed that his firefighters were becoming increasingly tired. And as every good leader should, decided that his firefighters needed a nip of brandy. If any modern firefighters are out there watching this, you can let us know if this is still standard practice for today's firefighters. Only a few hours into the blaze, disaster struck. Mr. Braidwood, who had visited the men several times, was engaged in giving them some refreshment, when, all of a sudden, a terrific explosion occurred. In an instant, it was seen that the whole frontage of the second warehouse was coming down, falling outwards into the avenue. Mr. Henderson, the foreman of the southern district of the brigade, who was standing within a few paces of Mr. Braidwood, shouted for all to run. The men dropped their hose branches. Two, with Mr. Henderson, escaped by the front gateway, and the others ran in the opposite direction onto the wharf, where they jumped into the river. Mr. Braidwood made an effort to follow Mr. Henderson, but was struck down by the upper part of the wall and buried beneath some tons of brickwork. His death must have been instantaneous. Several of his men rushed to extricate him, hopeless as the task was, but another explosion happening, they were compelled to fly. The sad fate of their chief had a most depressing effect upon all, and, to add to their trouble, the conflagration now assumed a most awful ascendancy. James Braidwood left behind him a widow and 6 children, and his wife had actually already lost a son from a previous marriage who had also died whilst fighting a fire in 1855. James Braidwood was buried at Abney Park Cemetery on the 29th of June, 1861, next to his wife's son. His funeral was attended by hundreds, possibly even thousands, of mourners. Even Queen Victoria responded to the loss of James Braidwood. She wrote in her diary, "It made one very sad upon hearing the news of the LFEE superintendent's passing." The buttons and epaulets from his tunic were actually recovered from his uniform and can be seen here. We mentioned those fire doors earlier, which were made of heavy iron. They had actually been recommended by Braidwood, and had they been used, perhaps the fire wouldn't have burnt quite as badly as it did. James Braidwood was unfortunately not the only casualty of this awful disaster. A gentleman called Mr. Peter Scott was also killed at the same time as Superintendent Braidwood, and it seems that 4 potentially opportunistic men had been collecting tallow from the river in their boat, which was then completely swamped by burning oil, and all 4 men were killed. And it seems a number of other men may have drowned when jumping into the river to escape the towering inferno they were now caught in. In fact, the number of deaths was probably actually comparable to the official number of deaths recorded in the Great Fire of London, which officially was only about 6 or 8 people, although modern historians have some fairly good reasons to think that number should have been way higher. Where I'm standing now, just outside the aptly named Cottons Centre, is basically where the main intense part of the fire would have been. In fact, I would have probably been stood in it right now. This is also not far from where the firefighters based themselves while trying to fight this inferno. And just around the corner from here is a sad reminder of that. Now, it's kind of hard to make out, but up there, that plaque, that stone plaque up there on that wall, is the plaque that was put in place to mark roughly where Braidwood was when he was killed. Not exactly that spot, but this is as close as we can get to it. It's nice that there is that marker up there, but it's a shame it's so high up because I'm not sure many people are going to really see it there. Let's just say if I die in a fire, I'd like my plaque to be, ground eye level. The fire itself drew huge crowds, with thousands of people gathering to watch, and London Bridge being described as just being absolutely humming with people, incredibly excited to be witnessing what at the time was described as the biggest fire since the Great Fire of 1666. It's also clear from many of the illustrations of the fire that there must have been many people clambering into boats to get a better view of what was happening. In many cases, probably at serious danger to their own health and well-being. Apparently even London's omnibuses were completely full with members of the public. Men were struggling for places on them, offering 3 or 4 times the fare for standing room on the roofs to cross London Bridge. Every inch of room on London Bridge was crowded with thousands and thousands of excited faces. Peripatetic vendors of ginger beer, fruit, and other cheap refreshments abounded and were sold out 6 times over. Public houses, in defiance of Acts of Parliament, kept open all night long and did a roaring trade. The estimates are that possibly around 30,000 spectators came from everywhere across London to witness this disaster. Now, I know the Great Fire of 1666 wasn't exactly recent to the people of London in 1861, but I think knowing what happened then, there might have been a small part of me that was tempted to not go as close to the fire as I possibly could, and definitely not packed in amongst thousands and thousands of other people. But like moths to a flame, this clearly became the biggest show in London for 2 whole weeks.
Behind me here is a plaque or information sign remembering this fire and also memorialising James Braidwood. At the time, this fire was described by people as the worst fire in London since the fire in 1666. I think helped by the fact that it was right on the Thames and everybody could see it.
And the fire continued to burn, not for hours, but for 2 solid weeks. A vast section of the riverside warehouses in this area were completely destroyed, and the financial damage was estimated at the time to be around £2 million. A enormous sum of money, which in 2026 would have been around £210 million. Once the flames had died away, and there was nothing left but smouldering rubble and ash, the Tooley Street fire had exposed serious problems with London's approach to firefighting, and the storage of flammable materials. Insurance companies had suffered massive losses because of the fire. Those insurance companies had also massively raised their premiums afterwards, and insisted on better storage of products in the warehouses. And efforts were made to make this happen, and there was huge public pressure to change the way things were done. The response just hadn't been good enough. By 1862, those insurance companies wrote to the Home Secretary, basically telling them that they couldn't do it anymore. The Tooley Street fire had proved that this was too much for them to handle. What had worked so far had become way too small for a city that was growing as fast as London. And because of this, 4 years after the fire in 1865, the government passed legislation creating the Metropolitan Fire Brigade. And for the first time, London had a publicly funded, organised fire service. And so we have the Tooley Street fire to thank for the first modern fire brigade.
This is one of the things I love about London, is everywhere you walk there are layers and layers of history. Some of it incredible, some of it awful, and all of it generally quite important. And this is a perfect example of something that was hugely important for London and its fire brigade. And I, in my 30 years on this planet, had never even heard of it. So next time you're walking down Tooley Street, try and remember, it might not have the sights of the river just across from it, but something incredible, awful, but incredible happened here that changed London for the better and made sure that all of us are safer today. Well, turns out I was so absorbed with walking around London that I actually forgot to finish the video. So here I am in my garden doing just that. I think ultimately this video is not just a reminder of, the importance of events like this in improving our safety today, but it's also a reminder of the incredible efforts of our emergency services, and obviously in this case, the fire service. They do an incredible job and an incredibly dangerous job to help us. So thank you to all the firefighters out there putting themselves in harm's way to keep us safe. If you enjoyed the video, remember to like and subscribe, and leave a comment down below if you have any suggestions for other historical events like this that you want me to cover on the channel. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.